The Crowd is a work on social psychology and is an absolute classic, of which the theories are still relevant today. The denominations have changed, but the motives, mechanisms, and factors of influence and manipulation of crowds remain the same. We are at the end of the 19th century. The author has witnessed a chaotic and uncertain era, a period of transition marked on the one hand by the collapse of the religious and moral pillars on which European political and social structures were based, and on the other hand by the emergence of new living conditions and thoughts granting crowds an absolute power which was reserved in the past only to kings, princes, and to the religious. According to the author, this line of brutal rupture between the old world and ruins and the new world in the making reveals to us that a radical change has taken place in the minds of the people, in the hereditary background of beliefs and thoughts. It was therefore of great practical interest from the point of Le Bon to analyze by the most rigorous scientific procedures the psychological and intellectual mechanisms which underlie the dynamics of crowds, and to lay, as a result, the cornerstone of a new discipline of knowledge, capable of shedding light on a large number of historical and economic phenomena, which until then were beyond understanding. What is a crowd? Gustave Le Bon defines a crowd as a group of individuals united by a common idea, belief, or ideology. When an individual becomes part of a crowd, he undergoes a profound psychological transformation. That is, he ceases to be an individual, he ceases to operate as an individual. The body of Le Bon's theory is based on the principle that the crowd must be analyzed as a psychological entity irreducible to the elements that compose it. This fundamental notion distinguishes the crowd psychologically from the simple aggregate of individuals. He states, an agglomeration of men presents new characteristics very different from those of the individuals composing it. The sentiments and ideas of all the persons in the gathering take one and the same direction, and their conscious personality vanishes. A collective mind is now formed, doubtless transitory, but presenting very clearly defined characteristics. The gathering has thus become an organized crowd, or a psychological crowd, and it forms a single being and is subjected to the laws of the mental unity of crowds. So, crowds are governed by a transitory mental unity and a collective mind which merge and orient all individuals in the same direction. This emotional and intellectual leveling dulls all personal will and cancels out all individual abilities. A philosopher in the crowd is no smarter than a mere illiterate. Le Bon says, the individual forming part of a crowd acquires, solely from numerical considerations, a sentiment of invincible power which allows him to yield to instincts which had he been alone, he would perforce have kept under restraint. He will be less disposed to check himself from the consideration that, a crowd being anonymous and in consequence irresponsible, the sentiment of responsibility which always controls individuals disappears entirely. According to him, the mind of the race is the unconscious substrate on which these special characteristics are superposed, which the crowd can acquire in certain circumstances. However, the formation of a collective mind by the pooling of ordinary qualities is not a source of intelligence, but of mediocrity, stupidity, and baseness. Le Bon compares it with a person being hypnotized. He says, an individual may be brought into such a condition that, having entirely lost his conscious personality, he obeys all suggestions of the operator who has deprived him of it, and commits acts in utter contradiction with his character and habits. The most careful observations seem to prove that an individual immersed for some length of time in a crowd in action soon finds himself, either in consequence of the magnetic influence given out by the crowd, or from some other cause of which we are ignorant, in a special state which much resembles the state of fascination in which the hypnotized individual finds himself in the hands of the hypnotizer. Le Bon maintains that crowds develop these special characteristics through three psychological states: irresponsibility, contagion, and suggestibility. The feeling of irresponsibility dominates crowds. Belonging to a crowd numbs the inhibitions and gives the individual a feeling of invincible power. Contagion refers to the propensity of individuals in a crowd to follow unquestionably The predominant ideas tend to be galvanized by a shared emotion. Collective interest takes the place of individual interest. Suggestibility characterizes the tendency to immediately turn suggested ideas into action, with the crowd in a state of expectant attention like a hypnotized person. This state derives from an unconscious, obsolete mind that is, in addition, of a primitive nature. Consciousness vanishes and the intellectual faculties found there are greatly wiped out. Like the primitive beings governed by the instinctive, impulsive mind, crowd psychology is the subject of various levels of irritation and excitement. By nature, it is mobile and dynamic, capable of going from horrific atrocity to the most absolute heroism. It can successively go through the range of the most contradictory variable feelings, but it is always under the influence of the excitement of the moment. Crowds want things frantically. They don't want them for long. They are as incapable of willing as of thinking. In its states of frenzy, a crowd suggested by ideas of murder and looting gives in to temptation. Le Bon asserts that the expectant state of crowds amplifies the effect of suggestions through contagion and facilitates the transformation of ideas into actions. Devoid of any critical mind, crowds cannot be otherwise than excessively credulous. The perception and observation of events are also altered, and nothing is too improbable for a crowd. This state of mind may explain the large number of collective hallucinations experienced by crowds. Most legends and myths have been created by the distortion of ordinary events. A crowd hardly separates the subjective from the objective. They believe the images invoked in their mind to be real, which most often have only a distant relationship with the observed fact. Gustave Le Bon recalls, what the observer then sees is no longer the object itself, but the image evoked in his mind. It was legendary heroes, and not real heroes at all, who impressed the minds of crowds. Le Bon considers now that crowds possess a binary mind which accepts beliefs entirely as absolute truths or rejects them as errors no less absolute. Not supporting contradiction and discussion, crowds are authoritarian and intolerant of supposed opponents. This state of mind, specific to psychically and intellectually diminished beings, pushes crowds to seek a security and stability with established beliefs or with a strong and productive authority. This refers to another typical characteristic of crowds. It is their conservatism with regard to the ideas, beliefs, and habits etched into the imagination of the group. While crowds are capable of acts which achieve both good and evil, Le Bon believed that more often than not, crowds commit barbarous and immoral actions. Why do crowds so often act in an immoral manner? He puts forth the following explanation. Our savage, destructive instincts are the inheritance left dormant in all of us from the primitive ages. In the life of the isolated individual, it would be dangerous for him to gratify these instincts, while as absorption in an irresponsible crowd, in which in consequence he is assured of impunity, gives him entire liberty to follow them. Carl Jung reiterated this idea and said, if people crowd together and form a mob, then the dynamisms of the collective man are let loose, beasts or demons that lie dormant in every person until he is part of a mob. Man in the mass sinks unconsciously to an inferior moral and intellectual level, to that level which is always there, below the threshold of consciousness, ready to break forth as soon as it is activated by the formation of a mass. Nonetheless, Le Bon believed he understood what motivated individuals to join a crowd. When an individual lives his life as an individual, that is, when he is forced to take responsibility for his life, he is apt to feel a crushing burden and sense of impotence he can't seem to shake. But in joining a crowd or a mass movement, the individual is temporarily relieved of this responsibility and sense of impotence, and comes to feel that he is capable of shaking the foundations of the earth. He says, in crowds, the foolish, ignorant, and envious persons are freed from the sense of their insignificance and powerlessness, and are possessed instead by the notion of brutal and temporary but immense strength. Le Bon thought that we are all, in a sense, a part of a crowd, as we are all motivated by ideas and ideologies which are socialized into us, and via communal action unite us with others in our culture. Many of our actions, in other words, are motivated by ideas, beliefs, and ideologies which we do not understand. Le Bon thought it was impossible to fully extricate oneself from all of these implicit ideas. Yet he did maintain that partial freedom and independence can be attained by bringing to the light of reason the ideas, values, and beliefs which guide our actions. And he claimed the tyranny exercised unconsciously on men's minds is the only real tyranny because it cannot be fought against. Further, the reasoning of crowds follows a very simple sequence and is characterized by an association of idea images without logical links. The notions of nuance and relativity completely escape the rudimentary intelligence of a crowd. He adds, it cannot absolutely be said that crowds do not reason and are not to be influenced by reasoning. However, the arguments they employ and those which are capable of influencing them are, from a logical point of view, of such an inferior kind that it is only by way of analogy that they can be described as reasoning. The inferior reasoning of crowds is based, just as is reasoning of a high order, on the association of ideas. But between the ideas associated by crowds, there are only apparent bonds of analogy or succession. The characteristics of the reasoning of crowds are the association of dissimilar things possessing a merely apparent connection between each other and the immediate generalization of particular cases. It is arguments of this kind that are always presented to crowds by those who know how to manage them. They are the only arguments by which crowds are to be influenced. A chain of logical argumentation is totally incomprehensible to crowds, and for this reason, it is permissible to say that they do not reason or that they reason falsely and are not to be influenced in reasoning. Reasoning requiring an effort of reflection is counterproductive and makes for an obstacle to the immediate desire of the crowd. On the contrary, it takes an exceptional idea of a powerful emotional intensity to seduce and persuade the psychology of a crowd. Now, religious sentiment also leaves its mark on all categories of beliefs embraced by a crowd. This sentiment encompasses all the manifestations specific to religious beliefs: fanaticism, absolutism, intolerance of opponents, blind submission, dogmatism, conservatism, extremism. Le Bon says, crowds always assume a peculiar form which I cannot better define than by giving it the name of a religious sentiment. This sentiment has very simple characteristics, such as worship of a being supposed superior, fear of the power with which the being is credited, blind submission to its commands, inability to discuss its dogmas, the desire to spread them, and a tendency to consider as enemies all by whom they are not accepted. Whether such a sentiment applied to an invisible god, to a wooden or stone idol, to a hero, or to a political conception, provided that it presents the preceding characteristics, its essence always remains religious. The supernatural and the miraculous are found to be present to the same extent. Crowds unconsciously accord a mysterious power to the political formula or the victorious leader that for the moment arouses their enthusiasm. Intolerance and fanaticism are the necessary accompaniments of the religious sentiment. They are inevitably displayed by those who believe themselves in the possession of the secret of earthly or eternal happiness. These two characteristics are to be found in all men grouped together when they are inspired by a conviction of any kind. The convictions of crowds assume those characteristics of blind submission, fierce intolerance, and the need of violent propaganda which are inherent in the religious sentiment. And it is for this reason that it may be said that all their beliefs have a religious form. Knowing the mental processes of crowds and how they may be influenced, how and by whom can crowds be directed? All crowds instinctively seek a leader, but he is usually someone who exemplifies the rationality of the crowd, a strong willed person who represents in the most extreme form the opinion of the crowd, not someone manipulating the crowd from outside. Again, leaders direct crowds through affirmation and repetition. Enough affirmation and repetition produces contagion, not just within one crowd but across times and places, which leads to imitation, as everyone wants to follow what the crowd is doing rather than think for himself. Le Bon says, authoritativeness and intolerance are sentiments of which crowds have a very clear notion, which they easily conceive and which they entertain as readily as they put them in practice, when once they are imposed upon them. Crowds exhibit a docile respect for force and are but slightly impressed by kindness, which for them is scarcely other than a form of weakness. Their sympathies have never been bestowed on easygoing masters, but on tyrants who vigorously oppress them. It is to these latter that they always erect the loftiest statues. It is true that they willingly trample on the despot whom they have stripped of his power, but it is because, having lost his strength, he has resumed his place among the feeble, who are to be despised because they are not to be feared. The type of hero dear to crowds will always have the semblance of a Caesar. His insignia attracts them, his authority overawes them, and his sword instills them with fear.